interesting. Yeah, we do.
Okay, we're gonna take this and get it queued up.
All right, and once again, we just punched right there.
You got it, same as the other room, just in a new,
Okay.
well, I guess our old location, right?
Well, thank you all for your forbearance and good manners. I'm going to talk about the frontier today. The frontier fascinates me. I lived in Texas for 32 years, and a lot of Texas is still the wild frontier. But the reason it does is that the frontier was and still is an essential component and ingredient of America. The vast concept of a land out there beyond Eastern civilization shaped not only the American character, but its very soul, its psyche. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893 said the frontier was now gone. It had filled up. But he also wrote that what it represented would live forever. A border without borders, an unlimited expanse, an unbounded opportunity. When you think about it, America was a frontier from the very beginning. Europe was fairly crowded compared to America. And here we started Jamestown and Plymouth, and the whole thing is a frontier. So we were starting off with a concept unknown to Europe. Some argue the values of the eastern colonies were transmitted westward and they became predominant. But Turner and many others argue just the opposite. The values of the frontier were transmitted eastward and became key characteristics of America. Those of you who have lived west of the Missouri, west of the Yellowstone, have seen the vast uninhabited lands out there. You have seen where man has conquered nature. You have seen where nature has conquered man. Texans talk about the brooding immensity of yet untamed land, broken only by isolated settlements. For those fascinated with it, fascinated by it like I am, the feelings of awe, inspiration, loneliness, deep respect, tinged with a certain amount of apprehension. We tend to think of our founding fathers as being landed gentry or lawyers. Many of them were, but George Washington was a man of the frontier. And one of the most significant battles of the Revolutionary War happened not along the East Coast, but on the frontier, and we'll talk about that. Many of our better presidents have come from the frontier. Jackson, Lincoln, and many heroes would emerge from the frontier, part real, part myth, but still legendary. Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Fears, but in it, watch for how the very beginning, America was a frontier and how that impacted the American character and ideals and still does. Watch for how democracy was fundamental to the frontier and how the frontier was essential to American democracy as we know it. Won't it be nice to get rid of these masks? Hopefully next month we can do it. Watch for how, unfortunately, the frontier was also about greed. Watch for the frontier battle of Kings Mountain, right down the road here. The British defeated the hands of frontiersmen, and this is what forced Cornwallis to head to Yorktown for reinforcements, and that's where he got cornered, locked in, and had to surrender. Watch for frontier values being front and center under President Andrew Jackson. Watch for Davy Crockett's frontier experience and his heading for Texas. Watch for 3 other frontiersmen who would become heroes of the Texan War for Independence and why. You know some of their names: William Travis, James Bowie of the famed Bowie knife, and Sam Houston. But finally, in any event, I hope you enjoy as much as I do Professor Fear's gift for masterful storytelling in the service of history. Because that's really what history is. It's a story. And today, it's a big part of our story.
Thus the Roman Empire, the superpower of its day, passed away. All things human must pass away. What matters is the legacy that you leave behind. Had you asked an emperor like Augustus or Hadrian, they would have said it's our Roman law, it's our Roman aqueducts. Augustus never would have imagined that the ultimate legacy of the Roman Empire occurred with the birth of a child in a far-off region of that empire in 6 AD, the birth of Jesus. Christianity was the ultimate legacy of Rome, but also the myth of the unity of Europe. And Europe, since the fall of the Roman Empire, has continued to look back to an ideal of unity and peace and prosperity. Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Empire of King Otto and of King Charles V, Emperor Charles V, and Napoleon himself. These were all attempts to regain that unity. And the European Union of today, well, perhaps it is that unity, far less heroic, but far less troublesome as well than the Roman Empire was to its neighbors. We too are a superpower. There was a time not many years ago that I said that the United States and the Roman Empire were the only 2 absolute superpowers that have ever existed. Politically dominant, militarily dominant, economically dominant, culturally dominant. I would have to change that assessment today, but that's all right. That's one reason for living a long life, perhaps the main reason, to grow and learn. We are no longer politically dominant. Nations like Germany and France just thumb their nose at us. We are most certainly not economically dominant. We are owned by China, other nations. And militarily, I'm not sure we are dominant. Culturally, we will always remain dominant. Our culture is not that of Beethoven and Bach and Goethe. It's the culture of rock music and McDonald's. Fast food and rock music. Those are unstoppable all over the world. You will find a fast food restaurant replacing an old-fashioned traditional restaurant, and even the most serious of terrorists will be found listening secretly to American rock music. So culturally, perhaps, but for the rest, we must either regain our dominance or pass away. And what will be that legacy when we do pass from the scene? I believe that America is the most generous, the most magnanimous, the most willing to forgive of all the empires that have passed across history. I also believe that we will leave behind a unique legacy of democratic freedom. For in this country, we have achieved a unique balance of freedom. You remember when we talked about the Athenian democracy, we defined freedom as consisting of 3 separate ideals that were not mutually necessarily inclusive. We spoke of national freedom, political freedom, and individual freedom. National freedom we defined as freedom from foreign control, freedom from foreign domination. Political freedom is our freedom to vote, to hold office, to serve on juries. And individual freedom is our freedom to live as we choose. And we have achieved a unique blend of these. If we were to trace the sources, we could certainly see in the Old Testament the ideal of a chosen nation, chosen by God to bring liberty to the world. We could see in Greece and Rome the origins of our ideal of constitutional democracy. In Christianity, the ideal that the individual soul has a unique worth and value. And from the English tradition of freedom, our ideal of balanced constitution and a bill of guaranteed rights. But what has made this unique to America is the frontier. We have our own heroic age. We have our own heroes who are worthy indeed to test steel with Achilles and Hector or Beowulf. We have our frontier and the heroes of our frontier. And our theme in the next series of lectures is the frontier, heroes, history, and myth. From the beginning, America has been about the frontier. What do I mean by the frontier? It is first of all the ideal of unlimited expanse, of a land of opportunity that goes on without limitations. The frontier is all about opportunity. Your opportunity to go as far as you can. It is all about democracy. And democracy is fundamental to the frontier, the idea that everyone is equal. Everyone starts off on an equal basis. It has no use whatsoever for ideals of inherited nobility, inherited monarchy. And it is about the opportunity to begin over and over again. You can fail and start over, fail and start over. And from the beginning, America was the frontier. 1607, Jamestown. Did those brave souls who set out from the cramped life of England, limited opportunity, hereditary nobility, did they set out and fly into Dulles Airport? No. They made their way in a most arduous journey across the sea, settled at Jamestown, found themselves surrounded by Native Americans who were suspicious, friendly for a bit, and then ever increasingly, as they should have been, suspicious of the greed of these frontiersmen. Because the frontier is also about the greed to use resources in any way that you want, the greed to take away other people's freedom, the greed to take other people's land, and indeed the ideal of individual freedom, as we would like to define it, is freedom to live as you choose as long as you harm no one else. For much of the frontier's history, the definition was simply the freedom to live as you choose. You didn't care what happened to somebody else. So they came to Jamestown and began to carve a flourishing colony out of the wilderness. And then the Pilgrims came in 1620. Did they fly into Logan Airport? Did they have to drive through Boston traffic? Did they have a Harvard University to go to yet? No. They came to a most inhospitable region. But they came to worship God as they chose. And they did not expect you to worship God as you chose unless you chose to worship the way they did. They did not bring religious toleration with them. You were free to live your life worshiping God as long as you followed the dictates of the Puritans. But there they were at a frontier, and they too cleared the forest. cleared out the game, built little towns and farms that flourished. All of the 13 colonies began as frontiers. And this is something that George III could not understand. He issued his proclamation in 1763 forbidding these frontiersmen to go across the Appalachian Mountain. Now, to George III and his cabinet, there in crowded London, these hereditary nobles, it made perfect sense. During the war with the French, Native American tribes had fought alongside the British and the American colonists, and they had been granted treaties, rights to this land. And to George, they were his subjects, every bit as much dependent upon his goodwill and having the right to his goodwill. Well, nothing infuriated the American colonists more than this bill limiting the frontier. And our revolution was carried through certainly by Harvard men like John Adams, by city men like Benjamin Franklin. But George Washington was a man of the frontier. The American Revolution was won out on the frontier. The age of 14, like a true frontiersman, Washington had learned a trade to survey. He had gone far out into the lands of what would become West Virginia and even into Pennsylvania, served in the militia, and throughout his life, he believed in this unlimited expanse of freedom that was the frontier. And it was on the frontier that the decisive battles of the Revolutionary War were fought. Nothing is more symbolic of this than the Battle of Kings Mountain, October the 7th, 1780. The British had failed to conquer New England. They had not been successful totally in their attempt to bring the middle colonies like New Jersey under control. Thus they turned to the south. And General Cornwallis sent out a flying column under one of his best commanders, Patrick Ferguson, a superb shot, dashingly handsome man, invented his own rifle, which he displayed to King George. Such a dashing man that he had two mistresses that always went with him on his campaigns. And he called them both Virginia, so he wouldn't have to worry about which one he was talking to at night. He sent forth to these frontier settlements of South Carolina and North Carolina a doomsday proclamation. Either these frontiersmen would sign a declaration of their allegiance to the king, or I will sweep through your towns, I will sweep through your farms and hamlets and burn them to the ground. Well, these men got together, particularly those who were from over the mountain, in what we would call Tennessee today. Coonskin caps, deerskin dress. Their preachers, as they called them, read this proclamation from the pulpits on Sunday. They went out into the yard of the church, they talked about it, and they said, let's just go settle this right now. Thus, they mounted their horses. There were only about 600 of them by the time they got to what is today Morganton, North Carolina. But they were joined by 400 more frontiersmen, the Virginia militia from the backwoods counties of Virginia. They knew that Ferguson had an army of about 1,000, and they went right after him. Started to sleet. Bitter cold set in this early October. They carried their muskets wrapped in the blankets that would normally cover them, so that their muskets would stay in good use. And they arrived in the late afternoon at Kings Mountain. We can still visit it. It's a wonderful national battlefield. They didn't wait till the dawn. They just got their horses tied up and started up that hill. Yeah! Oh, this is ominous indeed, said Patrick Ferguson. It's those damned yelling boys. And they had learned to fight in the bloody wars with the Cherokees and the Creeks along the frontier. They carried tomahawks with them, and they fought in the Native American style, firing from tree to tree. Ferguson had 1,000 good troops, New Jersey troops, serving in the King's Army, Americans fighting against Americans. And Ferguson himself, brave, decked out in a red hunting shirt that one of his mistresses had made for him. Blew his hunting horn as he rode up and down trying to rally his men, until one of his mistresses, feeling slighted, ran down and told the Americans, "Do you want to kill Ferguson? There he is. There he is in that red hunting shirt that slut made for him." He was shot, fell from his horse. His army quickly surrendered. The Americans went up to him. "All right, Ferguson, if you're alive, surrender." He just rolled over with pistol in each hand. "See you in hell, boys," and fired, and was killed on the spot. So was the faithful mistress, and they were buried together. When the British government decided to tidy up their grave, people doubted this story. But there were found, entwined, a man and a woman. The man still had the fragments of a hunting shirt. Well, that same army would drive Cornwallis. Now, the American army increased by Continental troops, drive him all the way to Yorktown and to surrender. The war was won on the frontier, and the frontiersmen were the bearers of freedom. This was exactly the environment that produced the most typical president of the frontier, Andrew Jackson. He was the last president to be a real founder. He served in the war against the British. He had been a messenger. He and his brother were taken captive. When as a captive, he was ordered by a British officer to shine his boots. He refused, and the officer gave him a slash with his saber that would leave a scar that Jackson would proudly show for the rest of his life. His brother and he were treated so badly by the British in prison that his brother got very, very ill. The mother finally came and was able to get their release, but the brother died. Andrew recovered, but the mother went back to nurse those other poor prisoners she had seen, and she died too. So Jackson lost a brother and a mother, and he had that frontiersman inveterate hatred for the British. He also had, and this we deplore today, the inveterate hatred of the frontiersman for the Indian and the Indian for the frontiersman. He would gain his reputation, a self-made man, learning the law, but he would make his reputation when he was elected colonel of the Tennessee militia and lead them to victory against the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend. And as Davy Crockett said, who marched with Jackson, fought at the Battle of Talladega before the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama, we shot them down like dogs. When we burned their village to the ground, Davy Crockett continued, we were hungry, but we couldn't find anything to eat. And then one of the boys discovered a stash of sweet potatoes in the basement of one of these houses we had burned. And the Indians had burned, and their fat had dripped down upon the potatoes. Well, I don't like to think about it now, but we sure gobbled down those potatoes. That's the cruelty of the frontier. And Jackson became the hero of the war against the Creeks, and then pushed on into Florida. And if there's one group he hated more than the British, it was the Spanish, the Dons. The Battle of New Orleans, he proved himself to be one of our greatest generals and defeated a crack British army, most of them veterans of the war against Napoleon. and inflicted horrendous casualties upon the British. And they never again made an attempt to conquer New Orleans or any other part of America. And when he was swept into the White House, he was the president of the Democratic frontier. He hated the idea of frontiersmen going into debt. And he saw the National Bank of the United States as one more attempt by the wealthy, well-educated elite with their moneyed interest to push through cheap money the frontiersmen into debt. So he took on that national bank and crushed it. And Indian removal. Today we deplore it. But the frontiersmen applauded it for the most part. And the land that had been guaranteed by treaties to tribes like the Creeks and Cherokees was taken away. Unless they were willing to live as citizens of the state, they were driven far away to Oklahoma. The Cherokees spoke about the Trail of Tears, and one of the soldiers who accompanied them on this death march said he had seen much cruelty and suffering in war, but this was the cruelest thing he had ever seen done. So Andrew Jackson was the hero of the frontier. And he had his proteges, frontiersmen like himself. At first, David Crockett. Throughout his life, Sam Houston. True men of the frontier. Crockett was a most remarkable individual. He was not quite 50 when he died at the Battle of the Alamo in 1836. And he wrote what to me is the best campaign autobiography I have ever read. For he rose to be a serious candidate, not for the Democratic nomination, for he broke with Andrew Jackson, as we shall see, but for the Whig Party. And in 1834, he began to write this autobiography. He was already a figure well known. There was a play put on about the hunter Nimrod, which was title taken from the Bible, but which was obviously Davy Crockett, who played all over the country to enthusiastic audiences. He was born, and his father was a man of some substance, opened a tavern, and wanted Davy to go to school. And Davy went to school the first day, beat up a bully. Then the teacher said he was going to reprimand him, so Davy hid out, wouldn't go to school. And his father found out about it, chased Davy with a big stick, and Davy said he was going to catch me. And then I made it over the hill, and the old man couldn't quite get up that hill. So he stayed away for some years, working at various jobs, but above all hunting. And that too was part of the real mythology of the hunt. He could hunt bear, he could hunt squirrel. And his autobiography describes these extraordinary, to us, marvelous sounding, marvelous in the sense of we can't really imagine them, hunting expeditions, crossing icy streams, swimming icy rivers, and coming upon Indians who want his hair. And he became a popular figure there in the Tennessee counties. And he was elected to the United States Congress. But remember, being a frontiersman is your right to do what you want. And Andrew Jackson saw Davy Crockett, who was his political protege, as a man who might be worthy of becoming president. So Jackson's advisors came to David Crockett and said, we can count upon your vote in this Indian Removal Act. No, you can't. Crockett, you yourself fought under Jackson against the Creeks. Everyone in your district is in favor of this Indian removal. A I don't care. It's wrong. We have treaties. And these treaties must be respected, or our government has no honor. I will not bow to King Andrew. I will bow to no man. I will make it clear that this Indian removal is an act of murder. If you do that, you'll get no more support from the president, and you will get no support from your constituents. Well, said Davy in his autobiography, it's always been my motto, be sure you're right, and then go ahead. That's what I did. And my constituents voted me out of office. Well, I said to hell with them, I'm going to Texas. And off he went. And in February he would arrive at a town called San Antonio, at a little mission called the Alamo. Along with him would join another, these typical figures of the frontier. Jim Bowie, born in Louisiana, not far from Lafayette, Louisiana. Got enough schooling to read and write, learned to run with pirates, and he, for some time, was a pirate along with John Lafitte, who gave crucial support, not only in troops, but in artillery. Jean Lafitte did to Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. Jim Bowie invented a knife, a huge butcher knife, and he killed in hand-to-hand combat the son of John Lafitte. And his legend grew just like that of Davy Crockett, half man and half alligator. And he made his way out to Texas too. Before Crockett, married, had a lovely wife, happy with a large ranch under the Mexican government, and then his wife died. Broke his heart. And he too wanted to start all over again, and he too went to the Alamo. And the third, another of the symbolic figures of the frontier, William Travis. William Barrett Travis, Buck Travis to his friends. He was only 26 in 1836. He had been born in South Carolina, studied a little law. You didn't have to go to law school in those days. You simply read the law with an obliging lawyer and then took the bar. But he wasn't going to be tied down. He was married. He had a son. His wife was a millstone around his neck, so he just said goodbye. And he too went out to Texas. And he too went to the Alamo. And all three were taking orders from Sam Houston. He was a Tennessee man. He had been the protege of Andrew Jackson. He too was renowned as a hunter, a fighter. You'll have to remember that Andrew Jackson fought several duels and killed several men. And the duel was part of the code of honor of the frontier. In fact, the frontiersman would tell you that no man or woman can understand honor in a society that doesn't have the duel. For there are things that are said about you that can only be taken away by blood. Houston had also gone into politics, been elected governor of Tennessee. And as governor, he married a considerably younger woman. The story was told that the first night, their wedding night, she left the governor's mansion, went back home, and would never talk to him again. The most scurrilous stories were told about him. He resigned the governorship, went to live among the Cherokee Indians. He'd been adopted into their tribe earlier, lived among them. His tribal name was the Raven, but the Cherokees also called him the Big Drunk. And he was big. 6'4", 240 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes. He was a deep, dark, and dangerous man. He had only one memento from his boyhood, a ring that his mother had given him. and a single word engraved upon it: honor. And he too went out to Texas and was there in the convention when the Texans proclaimed their independence. So Houston, Bowie, Travis, Crockett. Crockett, Bowie, and Travis, they would meet their destiny at the Alamo. And Sam Houston, he will meet his destiny as well, the Battle of San Jacinto. All four were men of destiny as well as men of the frontier. Men chosen to do one thing in life, and they found that destiny.
Well, if you have not visited Kings Mountain, I encourage you to do so. It's just down the road, and it's got an outstanding 30-minute video, and I tried to buy one, and they said, no, we're not going to sell any. But it describes the significance of this battle. And one factor in the victory was the frontiersmen had invented the rifle that has grooves in the barrel, and the bullet spins as it goes out. And it makes it much more accurate and much more far-ranging. And these rifles were a product of frontier necessity. They were invented on the frontier. One of the ironies of the Texas defeat at the Alamo is that Sam Houston, who'd been appointed general of the ragtag Texas Army, had told Travis and Bowie, don't stay there, you're going to get killed. But Travis decided to stay, and Bowie decided to stay, and Crockett was there then. And the story goes that Travis drew a line in the sand and asked anybody who was willing to die here to cross it. And everybody did except one man, a Frenchman named Louis Rose. He had been with Napoleon on the march to Moscow and had somehow survived that disastrous retreat where some 600,000 men died. And it kind of indicates that maybe he thought he'd had enough. The 13 days the Alamo held up Santa Ana gave Houston the time to retreat eastward, get some more people, round up some more supplies. And as you all know, at San Jacinto, the Texans whipped Santa Ana, forced him to grant Texas independence. And for 10 years, Texas would be a sovereign nation, the only state to join this country as its own nation. All the others joined as territories or were the original 13 colonies. So part of the Texan mystique is just that. You'll hear the talk about, we did it before, we can do it again, which is kind of silly at this point. But they have rights that no other state does. They have the same 13-mile limit out into water that the federal government does. And the Gulf of Mexico is full of oil. And from that comes a large part of the Texas wealth. Barb and I spent 32 years in Fort Worth. The saying goes that Dallas is where the East peters out and Fort Worth is where the West begins. And that was quite true. Texas now has 30 million people, but if you get west of the Pecos River, called Trans-Pecos, Texas, the frontier is alive and well. You go hundreds of miles, seeing very few houses at all. Well, comments, observations, any recollections of being out in the frontier? Really, if you get west of the Yellowstone, you're kind of in where there are not a lot of people out there. Blair, you want
just
a microphone.
Just a couple of comments. One, Houston was governor of Tennessee, apparently. I didn't know that. But the lieutenant governor in Texas used to be the governor of North Carolina, and that was Dallas, which Dallas, North Carolina is named. Yeah, total trivia. Okay.
Interesting.
It was, I found very interesting his discussion of Andrew Jackson. This was so positive until he finally got to the Trail of Tears. And it was, I found that an interesting bit. And then, of course, the fact that there were some people in his party that said, hey, didn't we make a treaty? And for all we could talk about the wonders of the U.S. and so on, we certainly have done a lousy job on treaties with the Native Americans.
Yeah. It's one of the things that I'm glad the history books are starting to point out, that we've got some good sides and we've got some bad sides too. And as he said, the frontier was all about greed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'll do what I want out there. Yeah. One other little bit of trivia about the Alamo. There were two survivors. One was a lady named Susanna Dickinson. She was the wife of one of the soldiers that was killed. The other was a black African slave. I can't think of his name, but they were both spared by Santa Anna for interesting reasons. Dickinson was told to go and tell other Texans what's going to happen to you if you continue to resist. The slave was released to tell other slaves that slavery had been outlawed in Mexico by the 1819 Constitution. And Mexico was interested in getting to populate the very barren north. And this is where the idea of 40 acres and a mule came from. The Mexican government promised they would do that. Now, they never did, but that's where kind of the talk later during emancipation, the rumor was out there that we can get 40 acres and a mule. Yeah. Any other comments, observations? Joanne, let me get you the mic, put it right up by your face.
Yeah. Well, I'm eager to hear from you how you and Barbie found it there. You were there for many years, and you said it was definitely different than you want. If you wanted to move over to the east side, what's your reaction to that?
Oh, I felt hook, line, and sinker for the Texan mystique. I view myself as some of the bumper stickers that said, wasn't born Texan, but got here as quick as I could. John Steinbeck, I think, summed up this Texan mystique as best as anybody. He said, Texas is not just a state, it's a state of mind. It's a passionate place, and like all passionate nations, it has a passionate history, and here's the part. Based on, but not limited by, the facts. And that's the Texan mystique. Yeah. It's rooted in fact and blowing up in 1,000 ways. And it creates a hoopla that most states don't have. Some states have state pride, but oh my. I'll tell you a quick story about this. The man and his little son are walking down the street, and a boy walks up to a stranger and says, "Howdy, where are you from?" And the man, father, grabs that boy and hauls him over to the side, and he says, "Don't you ever ask a man where he's from. If he's from Texas, he'll tell you, and if he ain't, no sense humiliating him." So those stories abound all over Texas. Yeah. Blair.
One other piece of trivia, as I understand it, Texas has the right to break into 5 separate states.
Correct.
And from the way you're describing it, it would never do it.
The joke is, nobody can agree on who'd get the Alamo. Yes, it has the right to break up into 5 states.
I have a minor nit, maybe.
Sure, please.
You were saying that Texas is the only independent country to join the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
How do you look on Hawaii? Hawaii just got unified when we sort of turned it over into our own territory.
Oops. Well, yeah, the only thing I can say though is it entered the U.S. then as a territory, but you make a good point.
Yeah.
You make a good point.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, you know how it is with those New England missionaries went off there. They went to Hawaii to do good, and they did well.
They did well, there you go, there you go. The Texans had this kind of thing for Oral Roberts, and so the saying would be, Jesus saves, but Oral invests. Well, all right. Well, as always, thanks for coming, and next month, I can't remember what we're doing.
That's why you're.
Oh, I know. One of my favorites, Theodora, from Dance Hall Girl to Empress of the Eastern Empire. This is a fascinating story. So, thanks for coming today. We'll see you then.
There you go.
That was great, Davy.
Thanks.
George.
So glad to see you.
George.
And that Kings Mountain day trip is a wonderful.
Yeah, you can do it easily in a day. Yeah.
Super.
Yeah.